They called it the craziest thing an Iowa hog farmer could do in the middle of a record-breaking cold winter, retrofitting farrowing pens with a makeshift heating system that divided heat zones directly on the damp, freezing concrete floor, while weather forecasts showed temperatures about to plunge to levels that could kill newborn piglets within hours of birth. Ethan Miller did it anyway, ignoring every mocking remark, every shake of the head, every warning that he was risking fire insurance claims and his entire herd. The first newborn litters were placed in that one-of-a-kind system just as the Iowa sky turned lead gray, wind howled across the farms, and the cold began to squeeze every breath. What no one knew at that moment was that within the next 72 hours, what everyone called Ethan's reckless stunt would become the thin line between life and death, and the people who had laughed the loudest would be the first to come to him, urgently asking how he had done it. Ethan Miller crouched in his retrofitted farrowing barn 3 days before the historic cold wave hit Worth County, his rough hands resting on the heavy-duty plastic curtain that swayed gently in the weak draft from the overhead ventilation system. The space inside was divided into such small heat zones that an outsider would think he was making things more complicated than necessary, each pen floor raised off the cold, damp concrete. Infrared heat lamps hung lower than recommended. Warm exhaust air from the ventilation fans redirected back instead of escaping as originally designed. Ethan stood still for a long time, listening to the steady hum of the test run, feeling the characteristic cold creeping in from outside, not the roaring kind of a blizzard, but deep enough to kill any unprotected life. He had lived here his whole life and was used to Iowa winters, but this one felt different. Not in the numbers on the forecast, but in a feeling he couldn't quite name, like a constant whisper of warning in his head. Last year, in what seemed like familiar cold, 17 of his newborn piglets had died within hours of birth. None were sick, none starved, no signs of distress or struggle. They just lay still on the cold, damp floor, their breathing growing weaker until it stopped. The barn had been sealed, the systems running, everything by the book. That was exactly why Ethan couldn't sleep for months afterward. Piglets are born with almost no fat, their tiny bodies unable to regulate temperature and just a floor temperature below. Safe levels plus post-birth moisture means the cold drains heat faster than any whole space heater can replace. They didn't cry, didn't fight, didn't call for help, they just faded. That thought haunted Ethan as he began sketching the first changes on the back of a feed invoice, not to do something bold, but simply to never again witness that silence. Laura Miller, his wife, stood in the kitchen doorway watching him scribble, not asking what it was, until he explained he wanted to keep heat exactly where and when it was needed, instead of trying to warm an entire space that didn't need it. She listened for a long time, then asked only one question, not technical, not about cost or regulations. If it goes wrong, can you live with it? Ethan didn't answer right away, but he knew he could live with being mocked, called reckless even, called crazy more than he could live with another winter. Watching tiny lives fade in silence. The mockery started the afternoon Mark Dalton stopped by and saw Ethan hanging an extra low layer of plastic curtain. Mark leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, watched for a moment, then shook his head. "You're turning that barn into a sealed box," he said, voice half worried, half sarcastic. "What about fire? What about suffocation? Insurance won't touch it." Rick Hensley chimed in when he heard repeating the familiar phrases Ethan had heard his whole life. Not by the book, not safe, no one does it that way. No one forbade him, no one reported him to authorities, but everyone told him not to do it. In this agricultural world, that was the heaviest pressure of all. Ethan listened, nodded, but didn't remove anything. He knew he wasn't following standard husbandry guidelines, but he also knew those guidelines hadn't saved 17 piglets last year. When he finished the retrofit, tested each heat zone, checked every lamp and airflow, more than a few pickup trucks slowed as they passed the farm. Curious glances, head shakes, half-joking remarks spread quickly. Ethan led the first sows into the changed barn, watched the newborns placed on the raised floors, trembling for a moment before settling as the surrounding temperature held steady at safe levels. From the door, Mark called back, "You're gambling with lives, Ethan. When it goes bad, don't expect anyone to stand up for you." Ethan stood straight, watched the truck disappear down the icy road. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He just felt the cold tightening outside more clearly, and knew that if he didn't try this, that cold would keep doing what it did best, killing in silence. That night, the weather reports began to change tone in a way Ethan hadn't heard in years of farming. No longer the usual forecasts of a few days of deep cold, then gradual warming, but heavier phrases repeated on the radio in the corner of the barn. Historic cold snap, record low temperatures lasting multiple consecutive days, unusually high humidity. Each time the announcer emphasized a new number, Ethan glanced at the thermometer on the wall, watching the mercury drop bit by bit, slow but relentless. He knew exactly what that meant for piglets. Dry cold, they could survive to some extent, but cold with high humidity was the worst enemy of fragile newborn bodies, draining heat so fast they had no chance to adapt. Time became the greatest enemy. Sows began farrowing in waves right as the cold wave tightened its grip. Each birth was no longer routine. It became a real gamble where Ethan staked everything he had done in this retrofitted barn. There was no more room to adjust, no time for further testing. Everything would either work right now or fail before his eyes. The retrofitted barn began operating in earnest, no longer an experiment. The infrared heat lamps stayed on continuously, casting low red-orange light close to the floor, warm enough to sustain but not bright enough to light the space. Ethan moved from zone to zone, eyes fixed on the small thermometers in each, memorizing the numbers by reflex more than thought. He noticed the power starting to flicker as the wind outside strengthened each lamp flicker, tightening his chest. A power outage, even brief, could be the line between life and death for these newborns. The air inside the barn grew heavy enough to feel on the skin. Days earlier, people still came by, still made half-joking remarks, still shook their heads in doubt. Now, no one came. No one laughed, no one warned. The cold had done what arguments couldn't. It silenced everyone. Ethan heard the wind howling outside the metal roof, creaking faintly, and between it all the tiny but steady breathing of the piglets. He knew every passing minute was a test, not just of the system he had built, but of his own decision. Time was not on his side, and he could do nothing but keep watching, adjusting the smallest details and waiting to see if what everyone called madness could stand up to a cold wave that had the whole region holding its breath. The first litters were born that very night, right when outdoor temperatures hit what the radio called life-threatening levels. Ethan was in the barn before the sows even showed clear signs, as if he didn't dare leave for fear of missing the decisive moment. When the first piglet slid out, soaked and trembling uncontrollably, Ethan quickly placed it in the low heat zone he had prepared. Within seconds, what he had waited a whole year for happened. The trembling eased, then stopped entirely. The tiny body pressed against the warm floor, breathing shifting from frantic to steady, and minutes later it began wobbling toward the sow's udder to nurse, as if the instinct to survive had been switched back on. Ethan didn't allow himself to exhale in relief. He repeated the process with each subsequent piglet, moving them into the marked heat zones, checking thermometers with quick glances that were almost reflex. In the dim red light of the infrared lamps, he saw the tiny bodies gradually stabilize, lying close together, no longer curled from cold. But the crisis didn't come from smooth operation. It came from the small failures that every new system encounters when pushed to the limit. A row of lamps flickered and dimmed for a few seconds as a strong gust hit outside, causing power to stutter. Ethan felt his stomach clench. He rushed to the breaker panel, hand on the wires to feel vibration ears straining for machinery sounds. A thermometer in one heat zone dipped below what he wanted, just a few degrees, but for piglets a few degrees could be fatal. He adjusted the plastic curtain, lowered another lamp, stood still, waiting for the number to creep back up. Time in the barn shrank to short, disjointed intervals measured by piglet breaths and his eyes darting between zones. Ethan barely left the barn all night. He didn't go home, didn't eat, only drank cold coffee from a mug set on a toolbox. Each time a sow delivered another litter, he repeated the entire process, allowing no slip even in one step. Outside, the cold kept pressing down on the land, and power still flickered with every strong gust, as if reminding him everything hung on a very thin wire. By midnight, when the first wave of farrowing ended, Ethan leaned back against the barn wall, watching the piglets huddled in the heat zones, bellies rising and falling in steady rhythm. They were alive. Not just alive, but nursing, squirming, making tiny sounds easily missed if you didn't listen hard. That was a temporary result, and Ethan knew how dangerous temporary could be. One night proved nothing in a prolonged cold snap. He had seen too many things that seemed fine collapse within hours. Near dawn, he was still there, eyes burning from lack of sleep, ears straining for any small change in the barn's sounds. The piglets had survived the first night, but there was no cheering, no sense of victory. Only near superstitious caution. Ethan didn't allow himself to believe this was success. He only allowed himself to admit one thing. What everyone called crazy had not failed on the very first night. And in his world right now, that was a fragile enough victory not to dare speak aloud. As soon as the sky began to lighten, the old agricultural radio hanging on a wooden post in Ethan's barn started broadcasting unusually urgent sounds, not the familiar steady voice, but the rhythm of an emergency bulletin. The announcer repeated the same phrase with careful tone: unusual losses being reported across northern Iowa. Ethan stood still, hand on the pen, rail eyes on the piglets huddled in the heat zones, but ears locked on every word. Within minutes, unusual losses turned to widespread losses, then to catastrophic losses as calls from neighboring counties flooded the studio. Hog farms reported piglets dying by the dozen overnight, even in sealed barns with full heating systems, all by recommended standards. Ethan felt another kind of cold run down his spine, not from the weather, but from realizing his worst fear was happening, and it was no longer hypothetical. The first call came from Rick Hensley, who had once warned him about suffocation and fire risks. Rick's voice on the other end was hoarse and exhausted, stripped of any edge from earlier arguments. He said more than half his piglets had died within hours, even though heat lamps stayed on all night, even though the barn was sealed like a fortress. The floor was cold, Rick said, as if talking to himself more than Ethan. I didn't think it was that cold. No blame, no questions, just the exhaustion of someone who had just lost what he thought he had protected properly. Then came more calls, familiar names from the community Ethan had known since childhood. The story repeated with different details, but the same ending: piglets lying still silent, dead before they could nurse enough. Meanwhile, inside Ethan's barn, a different reality existed in parallel, and that very parallel made him uneasy. His piglets lay close together in the heat zones, bellies rising and falling steadily, making tiny sounds of life. No chaos, no pitiful cries, just fragile stability. Ethan looked at it not with joy, but with a terrible sense of wrongness, as if two worlds were sliding past each other without touching. Out there, by the book barns, were becoming cold traps. Here, a solution everyone called crazy was keeping life going, at least for now. That phrase "for now" kept Ethan from relaxing. His solution hadn't been tested long enough to become truth, and he knew the difference between seeing signs he might be right and daring to believe he actually was. Each new call made a vague guilt inside him grow. What if he was wrong? What if his system was only delaying the inevitable, making the eventual fall hurt more because his piglets were alive right now? But another question just as heavy clung to him. What if he was right? And if so, why hadn't? He spoke louder, tried harder to convince others, forced the community to listen before this cold hit. That wasn't arrogance. It was a very American, very human question about personal responsibility in a system where people are used to following norms rather than outcomes. Ethan stood between those two currents of thought, one side near paralyzing caution, the other helpless frustration at watching a tragedy spread when he lacked the power or proof to stop it. He didn't dare call anyone back to say his barn was fine, didn't dare offer advice when he himself wasn't sure what would happen in the coming hours. Outside, the cold kept pressing down on the farms, covering silent barns with a thin frost of loss. Inside, Ethan sat beside a heat zone, listening to the steady breathing of his piglets, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, he no longer felt hope. Only the desolate feeling of someone surviving temporarily amid a collective disaster where the line between right and wrong action and silence blurred until even he didn't dare name it. After the flood of calls and the radio still steadily broadcasting heavier and heavier loss figures, Ethan finally left the barn late at night, not because everything was done, but because his body could no longer stand upright. He lay down in the dark bedroom, but sleep didn't come. Wind howled through the house corners, carrying cold through the smallest gaps, and every time a stronger gust hit the farm, he heard the metal roof creaking in the distance, a familiar sound that tonight felt unusually heavy. In his mind, the red-orange light of the heat lamps stayed on relentlessly, as if closing his eyes wasn't enough to turn it off. Ethan rolled from side to side, listening to every small sound, realizing what kept him awake wasn't fear for himself, but the feeling of being trapped between two irreconcilable responsibilities. On one hand, he had to keep his herd alive through this cold snap, because that was his job, his livelihood, the lives he had deliberately made fully dependent on his decisions. On the other, out there was an entire community drowning in disaster, people whose names and faces he knew, people who had done everything by the book and still failed. He couldn't save them, couldn't be sure what he was doing was the answer for everyone. Laura woke when she saw him still sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark. She didn't ask about the radio, didn't mention the calls, didn't try to comfort or offer familiar encouragement. She just sat beside him in silence for a long time, then asked softly, as if afraid to break something fragile, "Have you done everything you can?" That question wasn't judgment or encouragement. It was a mirror, Ethan didn't answer right away because he knew there was no complete answer. He had done everything he thought was right, but that didn't mean he had done enough. When Laura went back to bed, Ethan stood up, put on his coat, and returned to the barn as if that was the only place he still had control. Inside, the space was still lit by low-to-floor heat lamps, and the piglets lay close together in small heat zones, bodies pressed against each other, breathing steady. Ethan sat on a familiar wooden crate, back against the cold barn wall, and began counting not pigs, but breaths. 1, 2, 3, each tiny steady rhythm like fragile signs that life was still going. In that quiet moment, his greatest fear became clearer than any earlier mockery. He wasn't afraid of being called crazy, afraid of the community turning its back, not even afraid of losing money or the farm. What made him tremble in the cold was the possibility that an idea he had chosen, that he had stubbornly pursued, could kill these lives if it was wrong. Not death from natural disaster, not from system failure, but from his personal decision. He sat there a long time until the concept of time blurred, leaving only the sound of wind outside and steady breathing inside. Ethan waited for dawn, like waiting for an unspoken verdict, knowing that when morning came he would know a little more about whether he was right or wrong, but would never know for sure what else he could have done. When the sky turned pale gray and the cold still clung to the farm like a shell refusing to peel away, Ethan was standing in the barn when he heard a pickup truck skid to a stop in the yard, a rare sound on days when everyone tried to stay indoors. The door slammed, and seconds later Mark Dalton appeared at the barn entrance. He stood there a moment without stepping in, as if needing a few breaths to accept what he was doing. Mark's face was pale, not just from cold, but from many nearly sleepless nights, eyes sunken and tired. His coat was covered in snow that hadn't yet melted, white patches on his shoulders and sleeves like marks of a long night of failure. Mark didn't greet him. He just looked around Ethan's barn, eyes sweeping over the low-hanging plastic curtains, the floor-level heat zones, then lingering a long time on the piglets huddled together, bellies rising and falling steadily under the dim, infrared light. The air between them was so heavy Ethan could feel it pressing on every movement. Mark cleared his throat, then went silent again, as if searching for a way to speak without breaking what was left of his pride. Your barn," he said, the sentence trailing off unfinished, and Ethan realized Mark didn't dare say the word they both were thinking. Not right, not effective, but an admission stuck between self-respect and desperation. Ethan didn't respond with bragging or explanation. He didn't talk. Science didn't mention those who had mocked him earlier. He just stepped slowly to a heat zone, crouched, and showed Mark the raised floor off the cold concrete, the lowered lamp position to keep heat where needed, and how warm air was retained instead of vented out. His voice was even and brief, as if describing something obvious rather than a controversial idea. Mark took another step, leaned in closer, and in that moment his shoulders sagged, the usual hardness dissolving. "I lost nearly all of them," Mark said, voice low and hoarse. "Lamps on all night. Barn sealed tight. I did everything right." He paused, swallowed hard, then continued, no longer avoiding it. "I called you crazy." The words landed in the barn, and neither rushed to reply. Ethan didn't nod, didn't wave it away. He let Mark keep talking, understanding that what mattered wasn't his own reaction. "I was wrong," Mark said, and this time the words came without explanation or excuse. It wasn't a polite apology. It was the complete collapse of an old certainty that had made him sure he was doing things correctly. The social power between them shifted in that moment, not through debate or formal recognition, but through the very human bow of someone who had just lost what was most precious. Ethan still didn't boast, didn't comfort. He only said this system had only survived one night, that the cold wasn't over, and that he himself didn't yet dare believe anything. But Mark had heard enough. He straightened, took a deep breath in the biting air, and looked at Ethan with different eyes, not the eyes of a judge anymore, but of someone trying to survive. In the dim light and steady breathing of the piglets, that reversal happened quietly, but irreversibly, marking the first time since the cold snap began that the idea once called crazy no longer stood alone. After Mark left, the cold didn't ease. It seemed provoked, surging into the region with even greater intensity. By the 72nd hour since the cold wave started, outdoor temperatures hit the lowest in decades, a number read on the radio in a flat tone carrying the weight of a sentence. Ethan didn't need to check the forecast to know what it meant. The air was so thickly cold that every breath burned his lungs, as if they too had to fight to survive. Wind roared continuously, slamming into the barn walls, making the metal sheets vibrate in long waves, a sound that repeated endlessly like a reminder that everything was being pushed to the limit. The electrical system was stretched like a violin string. The infrared heat lamps ran at their breaking point, ventilation fans hummed but sounded heavier than normal, and Ethan understood there was no room left for any more adjustments. Every decision had been made earlier, every change locked in, and he couldn't intervene even in one small detail. Going outside now was impossible. Conditions weren't just dangerous. They were truly lethal, where cold and wind could strip body control in minutes. Ethan stayed in the barn, adding another coat but still feeling cold seep through every layer, not from indoor temperature but from unrelenting tension. He sat on the familiar wooden crate back against the wall, vibrating with each gust eyes, never leaving the piglets huddled in the low heat zones. The red-orange light still shone evenly, thermometers still hovered in the safe range, but Ethan didn't allow himself to trust that stability. He had seen too many moments that seemed safe collapse in an instant. Time crawled so slowly it was nearly unbearable, each minute stretching into a separate ordeal, and he felt clearly that if there was a line between right and wrong, it would be decided in these hours, not by argument or belief. Outside, the entire community was locked in this cold. No one could help anyone, no vehicles moved, no voices, only wind and structures trying to hold. When faint morning light began seeping through gaps in the barn roof, Ethan took several seconds to realize it was dawn. He had been in the barn too long, mind heavy from lack of sleep, eyes stinging from constant strain. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, afraid a hasty move might shatter the fragile balance that still held. When he approached the heat zones, the first thing he noticed wasn't the sight, but the sound. There was no deadly silence like the year before. Instead, there were tiny but clear signs of life, steady breathing, squirming piglets seeking the sow's udder. He crouched, widened his view, and saw the piglets still there. They were alive, not just a few, but nearly all. Their bodies were warm, not curled, not still pressed together in the heat zones he had risked everything to create. In that moment, Ethan didn't cheer. No sigh of relief escaped in words, no sense of victory like outsiders might imagine. Instead, there was a heavy emptiness, as if his body hadn't yet caught up with what his mind had just grasped. He stood still a long time, just looking as if needing more time to believe it was real. Then the realization came slow but clear. His system had held through the harshest 72 hours. The idea once called crazy had not collapsed. By every real measure he had been right. But that feeling brought no joy. The moment the thought formed images of the nighttime calls, exhausted voices, silent barns outside flooded his mind. The cost of being right was too high to celebrate. He had been right while so many others had lost fragile lives to the same cold he had just survived. Ethan placed his hand on the pen rail, feeling the warmth radiating from the surviving piglets, and for the first time since the cold snap began, he allowed himself to admit one undeniable thing: he had done the right thing. But at the same time, he understood that being right didn't erase the community's loss, didn't make the cold less cruel, and didn't make him a winner. It only placed him in a different position where responsibility no longer lay in proving he was right, but in facing the consequences of being right in a world that had paid too high a price. As the sun rose a little higher and the cold still refused to retreat, news that Ethan's barn had survived the 72-hour peak cold spread faster than any call or broadcast before. Not through bragging, but through the very real desperation of people with no other choice left. Pickup trucks began appearing again on the road to his farm, not noisy, not in groups, just quietly stopping and shutting off as if each person arriving understood that time allowed no social formalities. Retrofitted barns began springing up across the region, not complete or by-the-book structures, but emergency versions built from whatever was at hand. Plastic curtains pulled from old storage, heat lamps lowered temporary wooden, floors laid over cold concrete. No one argued about regulations or insurance anymore because the cold didn't wait to hear reasons. Ethan went from farm to farm or stood in his own barn when people came asking, but he didn't lecture, didn't persuade, didn't talk science or principles. He just demonstrated. Pointed, adjusted, kept heat low, cut drafts, raised floors, kept warmth where it mattered. Those who once shook their heads now crouched close to the floor, touched the warmth, and nodded without words. No one asked why anymore, because that question belonged to a world before this cold snap. Now there was only one question repeated urgently, sometimes breaking from exhaustion: how to do it fast. How to save the litter born last night. How to not lose another one before the weather warmed. Ethan realized his role had changed without anyone having to declare it. He was no longer the one who had to prove his idea. He was the one who had to help others recreate it in the shortest time possible. He spoke less than ever because every minute spent talking was a minute stolen by the cold. Hands once used to giving orders now pulled curtains themselves, hung lamps, propped floors, all with a focus never seen before. No one laughed, no one mocked, no one apologized. The shift didn't need confirmation. It happened through action, through hastily retrofitted barns, full of determination, through red-orange lamps beginning to appear in the night, where before there had only been freezing darkness. Ethan felt clearly that the solution once called crazy had left the personal realm and become a community reflex. No one cared where it came from anymore, only whether it could keep life going one more hour, one more night. In that orderly chaos, Ethan remained silent. He felt no pride, no relief. He just did what needed doing, repeating familiar actions like a duty that needed no name. Each time he saw a new litter placed in a temporary heat zone and stopped trembling, he didn't see it as proof of his rightness, but as one more chance bought from the cold. And as the retrofitted barns kept appearing everywhere, Ethan understood that this moment was no longer about him. It was about a community forced to act together, leaving every argument behind to race against time, where the only question left was not who was right, but who could act before it was too late. As emergency retrofitted barns began appearing thickly across the region, and the number of surviving piglets rose day by day, a different, slower, heavier kind of attention began turning toward Ethan's farm. It wasn't the familiar pickup trucks of neighboring farmers anymore, but vehicles bearing logos of local agricultural agencies and insurance companies. Officials and inspectors arrived quietly unhurried, carrying clipboards and cameras, observing Ethan's barn as if looking at something without a name in their system. They didn't object, didn't praise. No warning or commendation, just short questions about lamp spacing, floor height, airflow temperatures measured at low level. Ethan answered each one plainly without embellishment or persuasion because he understood that in these people's world, words carried less weight than data and results. The inspectors walked along the heat zones, crouched near the floor, placed hands close to feel the warmth-noted thermometer readings, then stepped back to view the whole. No one said what they thought, but that silence carried a different meaning than before. This wasn't the silence of doubt. It was the silence of confronting a reality that didn't fit neatly into standard boxes. The insurance representatives exchanged small nods, pointed to points they usually considered risks, then looked at the undeniable survival numbers. No promises, no threats. Just quiet acknowledgement that what was happening here hadn't caused the disaster they once feared, and more importantly, it had saved lives that by-the-book methods hadn't saved under the same conditions. Ethan sensed the very slow but very real shift in the system. It didn't happen through declarations or immediate documents, but through those responsible for safety beginning to record instead of object. They acknowledged not in words, but by staying longer than expected, asking more detailed questions, taking more photos from different angles. In that moment, the conflict between individual initiative and institutional standards wasn't fully resolved, but it was no longer a confrontation. The system began to listen, not because someone won a debate, but because results forced it to. Ethan didn't feel he had just achieved a victory. He just saw a small door cracked open where reality had a chance to enter before regulations could be rewritten. And when the logoed vehicles drove away, leaving faint tire tracks in the snow, he understood that what he had witnessed wasn't approval but quiet recognition that sometimes, in the most extreme situations, standards need time to learn how to catch up with what people are forced to do to survive. After the agency and insurance vehicles left, Ethan's farm gradually returned to a more familiar rhythm, though the marks of the cold snap remained deeply etched on everything. The cold hadn't vanished completely, but the emergency tension had receded, giving way to a rare quiet to look back at what had happened. Numbers began to be mentioned not in emergency broadcasts anymore, but in quieter, slower conversations. The number of surviving piglets on Ethan's farm was carefully recorded compared to previous seasons and neighboring farms. Those were numbers anyone could see were different. But alongside them were other numbers just as heavy, the piglets that died in this cold snap on farms that didn't have time or means to retrofit, lives lost before the solution could spread. Ethan couldn't separate the two kinds of numbers in his mind. Every time someone mentioned the results on his farm, he thought of the nighttime calls, the exhausted voices, the silent barns outside. Success, if it could be called that, carried no sense of glory. It didn't lighten his heart or erase sleepless nights. Ethan didn't stand before crowds to accept praise, didn't give interviews, didn't accept being called a hero or pioneer. He knew he hadn't saved everyone, and that truth kept him from feeling proud. When asked about what he had done, Ethan only said he hadn't been willing to stand still when he saw what he had done for years no longer worked in new circumstances. He hadn't invented anything great, hadn't changed the world of agriculture overnight. He had just observed, experimented, and accepted the risk that doing nothing was another kind of risk. In the days that followed, as he walked along the barns, watching the piglets grow stronger day by day, the dominant feeling wasn't pride but reflection. Each surviving life was a reminder that his decision had mattered, but each lost life elsewhere was a reminder that that meaning had come too late for many. Ethan realized that right and wrong in this context weren't clear opposites. He had been right in outcome, but that didn't lessen the community's shared pain. The long-term aftermath of this cold snap wasn't just in barn changes or procedures, but in a subtler shift in how people viewed risk and responsibility. For Ethan, the biggest lesson wasn't that he had found a solution, but that he had been willing to act when he realized old standards were no longer enough. And when he stood alone in the barn at day's end, the heat lamps now carrying no urgency but only normal warm light, he understood that what kept him farming wasn't a sense of victory, but the acceptance that sometimes the right thing is simply not standing still and waiting for everything to fix itself. When spring finally arrived, not in one clear moment but through small, gradual signs, Ethan realized that brutal cold snap had receded like a scar not yet faded. Snow melted slowly across the fields around Worth County, revealing familiar dark brown soil, and in the barns, the piglets that once trembled under infrared lamps had grown large enough to keep themselves warm. They scampered around, fighting over feed, making noisy, ordinary sounds, as if the cold that once threatened to kill them was now a distant story. Ethan watched it all with a feeling that settled in a way hard to name. He didn't hate tradition. He grew up in it, learned from it, and understood why it existed. The old ways had saved many lives in normal conditions. But the past winter had proven something cold and clear: tradition, no matter how valuable, can't save lives when circumstances change beyond what it was designed to handle. Only results can do that. Not explanations, not reputation, not long history, just live still breathing the morning after a brutal night. When Ethan passed neighboring farms, he saw small but clear changes. Floor-level heat zones were no longer considered odd. Plastic curtains concentrated heat methods, once called reckless, now appeared as obvious parts of farrowing barns. The crazy barn was no longer gossip. It was gradually becoming the new standard, not because anyone ordered it, but because it had proven its worth in the harshest moment. Ethan didn't step forward to claim credit for the change. He understood that, if next winter was as harsh, what would matter wasn't who thought of the idea first, but how many lives would be saved because of it. For him, the lesson of that winter wasn't daring to be different to be recognized, but daring to be different when no one stood on his side. That was a lonely choice, unglamorous, unheroic, often misnamed until results appeared. When he turned off unneeded heat lamps and opened the barn doors to let the first warm spring air in, Ethan knew this story would be told in many different ways. But for him, the core truth remained unchanged. What is called crazy today is often just the right thing that no one yet had the courage to do. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. If you want to keep listening to real stories about people, tough choices, and life and death lessons in the real world, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. See you in the next video.